For 25 long years, Judge Eleanor Kirkland ruled her courtroom not as a steward of justice, but as a monarch of manipulation. Her gavel, a scepter used to silence dissent, twist the law, and crush those who dared to believe in fairness. Attorneys learned to speak only when spoken to, their objections dismissed before their lips even parted. Evidence that could free a man was ignored with the simple wave of her hand. She didn't need to scream or shout, power hung around her like a storm cloud. Heavy and oppressive, pressing into the hearts of everyone who entered her courtroom. And in those 2.5 decades, countless lives were shattered, some slowly, others in a single verdict. Many of them were black men, accused on the flimsiest of evidence, buried beneath layers of prejudice dressed up as due process. But today, the tides were about to shift. Today, a man stepped into her courtroom who wasn't just there to argue a case, he was there to tear down a legacy. His name was Marcus Bennett, a defense attorney with fire in his blood and truth in his heart. This wasn't just another trial. This was personal. Marcus had spent years watching from the sidelines, collecting the broken stories of men who never stood a chance in Judge Kirkland's court. He had listened to their pain, their fear, their hopeless acceptance that the system wasn't built for them, and he carried all of it with him, every false charge, every biased ruling, every soul sentenced without justice, as he prepared for the one moment he knew would come, the chance to fight back. This day wasn't about strategy or legal acumen, it was about courage. About standing up in the lion's den and daring to roar. Because going after a judge with this much power was more than just dangerous, it was practically unthinkable. Kirkland wasn't just a judge, she was the law. She bent it, broke it, rebuilt it in her image. And no one questioned her. No one dared. Until now, Marcus knew the risks. His career, his safety, his reputation, all could be crushed with a single ruling, a single word from the bench. But he also knew something else, what was at stake if he didn't act. How many more men like Jamal Rivers would be thrown behind bars with no voice, no hope, and no chance? How many more families would be torn apart while the system protected itself? So Marcus walked into that courtroom not with fear, but with fire. He wasn't here to play the game. He was here to change it. And as the doors closed behind him and all eyes turned toward the front of the room, one truth rang louder than any opening statement. Today, justice would finally get its day in court. The courthouse in Jackson, Alabama, simmered beneath the sweltering southern sun. But inside Courtroom 3, the heat wasn't from the weather, it came from something far more suffocating. It was the kind of thick, invisible weight that wrapped itself around your chest and whispered in your ear, "Justice does not live here." It lingered in the air, settled into the wooden panels, and clung to every breath taken in that room. The murmurs of the crowd faded like they always did. The rustling of suits, the shifting of chairs, the clearing of throats, all of it died down. Not out of peace, but out of understanding, because everyone who entered that courtroom knew how it worked. The ending was never a surprise. The verdict was already etched into the walls. And seated at the heart of that system, high above the courtroom as if on a throne, was Judge Eleanor Kirkland. She didn't just preside over cases, she presided over fates. Her presence was unshakable, a monument to decades of unchecked authority. With her silver hair pulled tightly into a bun that seemed to reflect the unyielding order she demanded, and glasses perched low on her nose, she peered down at the room not with curiosity but with calculation. Her eyes scanned the crowd like a queen surveying her subjects, confident that none would dare rise against her. She rarely needed to speak loudly. Her power didn't come from volume. A single sigh, a twitch of her eyebrow, or the slow, deliberate tap of her gavel was all it took to remind everyone who was in control. In her courtroom, the rules weren't written in books, they were written in her expression, in her smirk, in the air itself. And the message was painfully clear: if the defendant was black, the battle was already lost. If the defense attorney was black, their arguments were dismissed as noise. If anyone challenged her, their careers crumbled before they reached the parking lot. It wasn't just bias, it was something deeper, something systemic, something ancient and ugly that had been painted over with the veneer of legality. Stories floated through the halls like haunted whispers. A young public defender who dared question one of her rulings, disbarred in less than a year. A fellow judge who voiced concern over her verdict, retired mysteriously 6 months later. No one challenged Judge Kirkland and walked away unscathed. Her word wasn't just final, it was law. And because of that, no one tried anymore, no one, until today. The sound of footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Sharp and deliberate. They weren't hurried, but they weren't hesitant either. They cut through the silence like a promise. And when Marcus Bennett stepped into that room, everything changed. He didn't lower his gaze. He didn't fumble with his tie or shift in discomfort. He didn't bend to the silent demands that had ruled that courtroom for a generation. No, Marcus walked like a man on a mission, every movement soaked in purpose. He had nothing to prove to Kirkland. And that's what made her look not startled. She had heard of him. The disruptor, the idealist, the lawyer who refused to play by the rules because he knew the rules were broken. She had dealt with men like him before, but none like this, none who had come prepared to face her not just with legal arguments, but with truth, the kind of truth that tears down empires. As Marcus approached the defense table, there was no grandstanding, no theatrics, just a silent certainty that settled around him like armor. His presence was not loud, but it was undeniable. In a courtroom where people either bowed or broke, he did neither. He had walked into battlefields like this before, where justice was a performance, and guilt was assigned before a trial even began, but today, he was not walking in to survive. He was walking in to conquer. His shoulders squared, his voice still sheathed for now. Marcus wasn't just there to defend a man, he was there to dismantle the legacy of injustice that had gone unchallenged for 25 years. As he stood before Judge Kirkland, their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. Not fear, not respect, something closer to a reckoning. And though no words had been exchanged yet, the courtroom could feel it. A silent shift, the beginning of a war not fought with bullets or fists, but with truth, strategy, and the kind of courage that didn't back down, not even from a judge who thought she was untouchable. Seated quietly at the defense table, Jamal Rivers looked like a man already written off by the system, not because of any crime he had committed, but because his skin was dark and the courtroom he sat in had never been built to see him as anything more than guilty. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped tightly as if holding on to the last fragile thread of hope. The orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced with a borrowed suit that hung too loose at the shoulders. The cuffs slightly frayed, but in this courtroom, appearances didn't matter, perception did. And to Judge Eleanor Kirkland, to the legacy of injustice she had meticulously upheld for a quarter-century, he was still just another black man waiting to be caged. The evidence against him was laughably thin, barely a shadow. A grainy surveillance video that showed a figure in a hoodie with no distinguishable features. A single eyewitness, an elderly white store clerk who had hesitated before naming Jamal, as if fishing for the answer he was expected to give. A weapon allegedly tied to the crime was found miles away, with no fingerprints, no DNA, no connection whatsoever to Jamal Rivers. But none of that mattered here. Not in Kirkland's courtroom, where facts were dressed up to fit the narrative and the truth was bent until it broke. Marcus Bennett knew this pattern too well. He had seen it play out in courtroom after courtroom. But this was different. As Jamal glanced up at him, his eyes wide with the quiet desperation of a man clinging to something just beyond reach, hope. Redemption. A future. Marcus looked back with unwavering calm. And in that silent exchange, a promise passed between them. Not today. Not this time. Because today, Marcus hadn't come just to speak the truth. He had come to make it impossible to ignore. And from the moment the trial began, the game was already rigged. The prosecution stepped forward with confidence built not from evidence, but from history, from the decades of winning without effort under Kirkland's reign. And sure enough, when they introduced new evidence that had never been disclosed in discovery, A blatant violation of legal procedure. Marcus stood up. His voice firm, citing Brady versus Maryland, demanding the evidence be thrown out. Judge Kirkland didn't even blink. Denied, she said flatly, her voice devoid of concern, as if the law were a suggestion she could take or leave. Marcus didn't flinch. Your Honor, he said again, respectful but unyielding, this is a fundamental violation. But Kirkland cut him off with a sigh sharp enough to slice through steel. Mr. Bennett, she snapped, if you want to grandstand, I suggest you do it elsewhere. This court has no time for theatrics. Theatrics, that was what she called due process now. That was what she called the law, when it wasn't being used to her advantage. And across the room, Travis Holden, the fresh-faced prosecutor, barely out of law school, sat upright with a blank expression that slowly began to melt into comfort as Judge Kirkland spoke to him with a voice softer, almost nurturing. Mr. Holden, let's move on. We wouldn't want to waste the jury's time, she said, guiding him like a puppeteer, molding his missteps into momentum. Marcus saw it, so did the jury. They weren't blind. Even those who had walked into that room already convinced of Jamal's guilt couldn't deny what they were witnessing. A courtroom tilted. A judge who was no longer impartial but deeply, blatantly complicit. And in the gallery, the pens of reporters scratched faster, their expressions shifting from passive observation to stunned disbelief. The silence that hung in the room wasn't just discomfort, it was recognition. A realization that they weren't just watching bias, they were watching injustice in its purest, most poisonous form. And still, no one spoke, because in this courtroom, silence wasn't just expected, it was how people survived. But Marcus Bennett didn't come to survive. He came to speak, he came to fight, and as he stood tall behind the defense table, his jaw clenched, his voice steady despite the blatant violations unfolding before him, he knew that silence would no longer be an option. The time for fear had ended. The moment for truth had arrived. The atmosphere in the courtroom had begun to shift, subtle at first, like a ripple beneath still water, but Marcus Bennett could feel it deep in his bones. It was the kind of shift that didn't announce itself with fanfare or thunder, but hummed just beneath the surface, waiting to break free. Years of standing in courtrooms like this had taught Marcus to read the room with the precision of a surgeon. He knew when the tide was turning. Even before others did. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning. As he moved toward the witness stand, each step was deliberate, controlled, not a single movement wasted. He knew eyes were on him, the jury watching more closely now, the reporters scribbling faster, and Judge Kirkland, though still stone-faced, had fingers that curled ever so slightly against her bench, a micro-expression. But one Marcus didn't miss. Seated before him was Harold Whitmore, the prosecution's star witness, an aging man in his late 60s. Thin, restless, his hands trembling with a nervous energy that betrayed the certainty he was supposed to project. Marcus didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence breathe. Let it stretch over the courtroom like a weighted blanket, letting every second press down on Whitmore's shoulders until the man began to squirm under the weight of it. Then, finally, Marcus spoke, smoothly, calmly, but with a sharpness that cut through the air. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone respectful but unrelenting, "you testified under oath that you saw my client, Jamal Rivers, at the scene of the robbery." "That's correct." The old man cleared his throat, already uneasy. "Yes, sir." Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if probing deeper without even trying. "You're sure?" And there, for just a flicker of a second, came the hesitation, the crack in the facade. "I mean, I saw someone who looked like him," Whitmore replied, and that was all Marcus needed. Like a skilled musician hitting the perfect chord, he let the statement echo across the room, then turned deliberately toward the jury. "You think you saw him?" Marcus repeated softly. "That's not quite the same as knowing you saw him, is it?" The jury shifted. A few members exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, their expressions tinged with doubt. Marcus continued, opening a file and reading from it with the same measured cadence. In your original statement to the police, you said, and I quote, "I didn't get a good look at him. It was dark. I only saw him for a second." The silence that followed was powerful. In a courtroom where everything had been orchestrated to favor the prosecution, the truth was beginning to find its voice. Marcus locked eyes with Whitmore. In that statement, "You weren't sure at all, were you, Mr. Whitmore?" The old man squirmed, voice cracking. I just remembered more later." But Marcus didn't let up. He stepped closer, voice tightening just slightly, not aggressive, but razor sharp. "Did you remember? Or did someone help you remember?" Whitmore's swallow was audible. The tension in the room was so taut. It could have snapped. Marcus knew this was it, the moment to push, to break open the truth that had been buried under years of manipulation and fear. But he wasn't finished yet. With a deliberate slowness, he returned to the defense table, unlatched his briefcase, and pulled out a set of documents. He let anticipation settle, letting the room lean in, waiting. Then, in a voice clear and unshakable, he addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense has obtained evidence that calls this entire case into question." Kirkland stiffened, just slightly, but enough. Marcus placed a series of surveillance stills onto the evidence screen. The images flickered onto the courtroom monitor, showing footage from a different angle than the prosecution's video, an angle that made one fact glaringly obvious. "This footage," Marcus said, "shows that the suspect in question is at least 2 inches shorter than my client." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. But Marcus wasn't done. He reached for another document, holding it high. "And here," he continued, "is proof that Mr. Whitmore received a direct deposit of $5,000 just days after identifying my client." A gasp from the gallery. A jolt in the jury box. Even Travis Holden, the young prosecutor, looked visibly shaken, flipping through his notes in quiet panic. Marcus turned back to the stand, his gaze locked onto Whitmore. "Do you still stand by your testimony?" he asked. Not as a challenge, but as a final call for the truth. But Whitmore had no answer. No more words, no more lies to lean on. Because in that moment, the truth had spoken louder than anything he could say, and for the first time in 25 years. Judge Kirkland was no longer the one controlling the courtroom. Marcus had cracked the foundation. The air in the courtroom had shifted from tension to electricity, something alive. Buzzing, almost combustible. For the first time, Judge Eleanor Kirkland was no longer the architect of the silence that gripped the room, she was its prisoner. The jurors, once passive participants in a play whose ending had always been pre-written, were now fully awake, their gazes sharper, their doubts louder. The reporters, pens flying across notepads, captured the storm as it brewed. Even the young prosecutor, Travis Holden, who had begun the trial with wide-eyed obedience, now looked like a man realizing he'd built his career on sand. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Bennett. Not yelling, not pleading, just standing there with a stillness so powerful, it drowned out everything else. When Judge Kirkland's voice finally broke through the silence, it was sharp and cutting, but not as invincible as it once sounded. "Enough," she snapped, her voice reverberating like a slap against cold marble. She stared at Marcus with fury in her eyes, the edges of her perfectly composed mask beginning to crack. "You think you're clever, Mr. Bennett," she hissed, her tone laced with disdain, "parading around this courtroom like you're some kind of hero. But you're nothing more than a cheap lawyer with a flair for theatrics." Marcus didn't blink, he didn't flinch, he didn't respond with rage or defense. He simply adjusted his tie, slow and deliberate, and took a single step forward, the weight of it louder than any shout. "And you," he said smoothly, his voice like a scalpel, "are dangerously close to proving everything I've been saying about you." A ripple of reaction spread through the gallery like a gust of wind through dry leaves. Kirkland's face darkened. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in her own courtroom. "You're testing my patience, Mr. Bennett," she warned, her tone now low, venomous. "One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt of court." Marcus tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity. "For what exactly?" he asked, the calm in his voice a challenge of its own. For asking this court to follow the law. Another murmur from the jury. Someone in the gallery let out a stifled laugh. Kirkland's fingers tightened around her gavel. She could feel it slipping. Control. Authority. Fear. The courtroom that had once moved at the pace of her breath was now slipping out of rhythm. She slammed her gavel once. Then again. Then a third time. Each strike louder. More frantic than the last. You are out of line. Mr. Bennett, she shouted. But Marcus took another step forward. His voice steady, unwavering, unshakable. No, Your Honor, he said with a calm that cut through the rising panic like a blade. For the first time in this courtroom, you are. The words dropped like a hammer. And the silence that followed wasn't just stillness, it was revolution. Judge Kirkland sat rigid, her back straight, her jaw clenched, rage simmering just beneath her skin. But beneath that fury, something else had crept in, something unfamiliar, something she hadn't felt in decades. Fear, and what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that Marcus Bennett wasn't finished. Not even close. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just heavy, it was a living thing. Thick with tension, swollen with anticipation, and pulsing like a heart just before it bursts. Judge Eleanor Kirkland sat rigid behind the bench. Her gavel still clutched tightly in her hand as though the weight of it could tether her authority before it slipped away completely. But she could feel it, the room no longer belonged to her. The jurors, once docile, now leaned forward with narrowed eyes. The reporters had stopped merely documenting and had begun witnessing. Even her own prosecutor sat frozen, hands gripping his notes like a man clinging to a sinking ship. And Marcus Bennett stood at the center of it all. Calm, calculated, unwavering, his presence commanding not by force but by undeniable truth. When he reached once more into his briefcase, slow and precise, it felt like the air itself held its breath. He pulled out a sealed manila envelope. Not opening it, not speaking immediately. Instead, he placed it gently on the defense table, letting his fingers rest lightly on it like a promise. Then, he looked directly at Kirkland, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. Since we're discussing facts, he said, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence into the record. A subtle but visible twitch in Kirkland's jaw betrayed the storm behind her mask. You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Bennett, she warned, but her voice, once cold steel, was now brittle. Marcus raised a brow. No, Your Honor, he said quietly, I'm playing to win, and with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who already knew how this would end. He broke the seal, but before he could reveal the contents, the courtroom doors exploded open with a force that silenced everything. The bang echoed like thunder, and every head whipped toward the sound. Framed in the doorway stood two federal agents in dark suits, their badges glinting under the courtroom lights like swords unsheathed. Time stopped. The air that once belonged to Judge Kirkland collapsed around her like crumbling stone. She rose, instantly on edge, her voice sharp and disoriented. This is a courtroom, she barked. Whatever this is, it can wait. But the lead agent stepped forward, voice calm, unwavering, and loud enough for everyone to hear. Judge Eleanor Kirkland, we need to speak with you immediately. Kirkland's breath caught in her throat. I am in the middle of a trial, she hissed. This is highly irregular. But the agent didn't blink. No, Judge Kirkland, he said, this cannot wait. The room froze, the tension tightened like a noose. Then came the words that shattered the last of her illusion. You are under federal investigation for bribery, obstruction of justice, and repeated violations of civil rights law. The words didn't just land, they detonated. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The jury sat stunned. Kirkland's lips parted as if to deny it. But no sound came. The agent continued, methodical and ruthless, outlining her crimes, decades of manipulating trials, taking payments in exchange for predetermined rulings, disproportionately targeting black defendants, and turning justice into a personal empire of power. Marcus didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply watched the truth do what it had always been meant to do, burned down corruption with the heat of its light. Kirkland, once unshakable, now stood in trembling disbelief. Her eyes darted to the courtroom officers, the same ones who had once enforced her every order without hesitation. "Stop them," she commanded. "That's an order." But none of them moved. Not one. They looked at her the way one might look at a fallen statue, something that had once demanded reverence. Now just a relic of something broken. She reached for her phone, fingers trembling, punching in a number she had always relied on, a name that once guaranteed protection. It rang, once, twice, then voicemail. Again, no answer. The protection she had built her reign on was gone. She looked around, searching for an anchor, but there was none, only eyes, watching, judging, witnessing. She turned back to the agents, her voice shrill now, desperate. "This is absurd. This is a politically motivated smear." But no one was listening. Not anymore. Judge Eleanor Kirkland stood frozen. Her fingers clenched tightly around the gavel as if its cold wooden weight could somehow tether her to the authority that was slipping through her grasp like sand in a storm. She had reigned over this courtroom for more than 2 decades with iron precision, with the unwavering certainty that no matter what she said or did, the system would protect her, shelter her, obey her. But now, as the federal agents stood unmoving before her, their expressions unreadable, their presence undeniable, she realized something she had never considered possible. She was no longer in control. Her voice rose, sharp and brittle, tinged with desperation and the cracking echo of disbelief. "This is a politically motivated attack," she spat, her eyes scanning the room for an ally, for a lifeline, for anything that would reaffirm the myth of her invincibility. "A disgraceful, orchestrated smear on my name. I have upheld the law with integrity for 25 years. But the courtroom that had once leaned into her every word now remained still, unmoved. Even the courtroom officers, men who had enforced her every order without hesitation, now refused to meet her gaze. She barked again, louder this time, the tremor in her voice unmissable. "Stop them. That's an order." Still, no one moved. Her eyes flickered wildly from face to face, searching for fear, for obedience, but found only detachment. Perhaps even quiet vindication. The woman who had held lives in the palm of her hand now stood abandoned, stripped of the armor her position once afforded. Panic bloomed in her chest like wildfire. She reached for her phone, dialing a number etched into memory. A name she had whispered before when trouble loomed, someone powerful. Someone who had always answered. But now, the phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and went to voicemail. Again she tried, and again, nothing. Her protection was gone, her silence, her secrets, her years of favored decisions, all of it had finally caught up to her. She dropped the phone, its clatter against the desk sharp and final, a sound that echoed louder than her words ever could. Her last move was desperation incarnate. She turned to her courtroom officers, men whose loyalty she had long taken for granted. "Help me," she demanded, now, but they didn't move, not because they couldn't, because they wouldn't. Their eyes, once filled with deference, were now cold mirrors reflecting the truth she had refused to see. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Her hands trembled, the edges of her vision blurred. Her voice, once a weapon, now cracked under the weight of reality. She tried to speak again, but the words stuck in her throat. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. It was over. Her reign, her facade, her illusion of righteousness, it was all crumbling. Right here, before the very people who had suffered beneath it. She staggered slightly, as if the weight of her own corruption was too much for her legs to bear. And for the first time in 25 years, Judge Eleanor Kirkland, who had commanded this courtroom with fear and control, stood exposed. Not as a judge, but as a criminal, and no one, not a juror, not a bailiff, not a lawyer, rose to stop what was coming. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Eleanor Kirkland, the woman who had once ruled this space with unchallenged authority, now stood trembling. her once commanding voice reduced to stammers and empty threats. The federal agents didn't flinch, didn't raise their voices. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was enough. When the lead agent finally stepped forward and unfolded the arrest warrant with a slow, deliberate precision, the sound of the crisp paper seemed louder than any gavel strike. "Judge Eleanor Kirkland," he declared with chilling clarity, "you are under arrest for multiple counts of bribery, obstruction of justice, and willful violations of civil rights under federal law." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Kirkland's knees barely held. Her lips parted again, as if some argument might still crawl from the ashes of her ego. But no sound came, because what was left to say? For over 2 decades she had signed away the freedom of countless men, most of them black, without remorse, without hesitation, reducing their futures to footnotes in her climb to power. And now, as the agent continued detailing her crimes, knowingly denying due process, accepting bribes in exchange for guilty verdicts, shaping sentences for profit, everyone in that room knew the truth. She had not merely failed justice, she had become its greatest enemy. The agents moved forward. The handcuffs clicked, clean and final, a sound that rang like poetic vengeance through the chamber. For the briefest second, Kirkland tensed, as if to resist, but she didn't. Her shoulders dropped, her gaze fell, and she allowed herself to be led down the steps, past the jury, past the gallery, past the people she had once ruled through fear. No one stood, no one spoke, and in that stillness, she was more alone than she had ever been. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and she disappeared through them, no longer a judge, but a prisoner. And then, like a dam cracking, the silence shattered. A gasp, a breath, a murmur that swelled into a wave. Eyes welled with tears. A woman in the back clutched her chest, whispering her son's name, the one Kirkland had sentenced years ago. A man in the front row, who had once sat in the same defendant's chair as Jamal, dropped his head into his hands, the weight of his past finally allowed to shake loose. Justice, for the first time in years, had breathed life into this courtroom. But Marcus Bennett wasn't done. As the energy swirled, he turned, not to the crowd, not to the agents, but to the prosecution's table. Travis Holden sat there, pale and shaken, the edges of his paper clenched in fists that trembled. For months, maybe years, he had walked beneath Kirkland's shadow, enjoying her protection, benefiting from her cruelty while never questioning if the outcomes were just. But now, he was just a young man with no more shield to hide behind. Marcus stepped forward, voice unwavering. "Mr. Holden," he said, calm and precise, "the judge presiding over this trial has just been arrested for corruption. The foundation of this case has crumbled. I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, Jamal Rivers." Silence again, but this time, the weight of justice filled it. Not fear. Holden swallowed, looked down at his notes that no longer meant anything, then up at the new judge who had replaced Kirkland in haste. A man known not for dominance but for fairness. And that judge, after a long pause, finally nodded. "The motion to dismiss is granted," he said clearly. "All charges against Jamal Rivers are hereby dropped. Bailiff, remove his restraints." The room exhaled in one collective breath. Jamal sat stunned. For a moment, he didn't move. As the bailiff stepped behind him and unlocked the cuffs, Jamal stared at his wrists like he couldn't quite believe they were his again. He flexed his fingers slowly, testing his freedom, and then his shoulders shook, not with fear, not with rage, but with something far more powerful: release. Outside, the sunlight bathed the courthouse steps as the doors opened wide. Jamal walked out, blinking against the brilliance of the day, lifting his face to the sky he hadn't seen without bars in years. It felt different. It felt endless. Behind him, Marcus stood in the doorway, not celebrating, not boasting, just watching. He had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. There were still more Jamals, more broken courtrooms, more corrupt systems waiting to be challenged. And as he stepped into the sunlight behind his client, the fire in his eyes said one thing clearly: This was only the beginning. For the first time in years, the courtroom felt lighter, not in noise, but in spirit, as if the chains that had long wrapped themselves around its pillars, benches, and walls had finally been broken. The faces that once wore numb acceptance now carried something unfamiliar but deeply human: hope. In the gallery, a woman whose son had been sentenced unjustly years ago cupped her trembling hands over her mouth, tears falling freely as if finally grieving not just loss but release. A man in the front row, someone who had once sat in the very defendant's chair now occupied by Jamal, let out a ragged breath, as though he had just been pardoned too, not by law but by truth. It was as if the courtroom itself, brick and wood and silence, had taken a long breath after decades of being suffocated. But amidst the quiet joy and stunned disbelief, Marcus Bennett remained grounded. He didn't raise his fists in victory. He didn't look for applause. He simply turned, calm, steady, and faced the man who had just regained his freedom. Jamal Rivers, still seated, seemed frozen in place. As the last of the cold metal slipped off his wrists, his hands dropped to his lap, still as stone, like he needed time to remember they belonged to him again. Then slowly, almost cautiously, he raised his eyes to meet Marcus's. In them was a question, a disbelief, a silent echo of everything he had endured. And in Marcus's gaze, there was only one answer: you're free. You matter. You were never alone. The judge's voice confirmed it aloud. All charges dropped, but the sound of that freedom wasn't in words. It was in the absence of fear. In the space finally cleared for dignity to return, Jamal rose with slow, reverent movements. He looked around, as if trying to make sense of the moment. The reality, the fact that this courtroom, this very place that was built to destroy him, had become the setting of his liberation. When he stepped outside, the sunlight struck his face like a blessing, warm and real and entirely his. For years, his sky had been fractured by bars, his days numbered by despair. But now, the sky stretched wide and bright and honest. He lifted his face to it, eyes closed, letting it wash over him. And slowly, like a man waking from a long nightmare, he smiled, not big, not loud, just enough for the world to know that he had made it. Behind him, Marcus stood at the top of the courthouse steps, watching not just Jamal, but everything this moment represented, the cracks finally breaking open the dam. The truths no longer whispered but shouted. The people no longer dismissed but believed. He had fought for Jamal. Yes, but Jamal was never just one man. He was hundreds, thousands, maybe millions, men forgotten, silenced, sentenced by a system designed to break them. And Marcus knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't the final chapter. This was a spark, a beginning. The courtroom had been won. But the world was still waiting. There were more Kirklands out there, dressed in different robes, protected by different networks. And there were more Jamals too, still sitting in cold cells, still praying for someone to believe them, still hoping for their Marcus to walk through the door. So as Marcus stepped down from the courthouse steps, sunlight glinting off his shoulders, he carried with him more than just victory. He carried a mission. Not driven by ego or vengeance, but by memory and justice and the unshakable belief that no one, no matter their race or background, should be crushed by the very system built to protect them. He didn't need to look back. He didn't need to say a word. The story had already been written in every breath of that courtroom, in every tear in the gallery, in every footstep Jamal took into the light. And as they walked forward, free man and fighter, survivor and defender, the world finally tilted, even if just slightly, toward justice.